This evening, we're delighted to welcome Michael Mateson Miller. He's the director of the documentary Poverty, Inc. and the Poverty Cure DVD series with the Acton Institute. And the title of his lecture this evening is The Intellectual Foundations of the New Evangelization. Michael lectures internationally on such themes as moral philosophy, economic development, and social theory. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of Notre Dame, an MA from Nagoya University's Graduate School of International Development in Japan, an MA in philosophy from my alma mater, Franciscan University of Steubenville, Ohio, and an MBA in international management from Thunderbird Graduate School of Global Business. He serves on the President's Advisory Council of Aquinas College in Nashville, the board of the Dietrich von Hildebrand Legacy Project, and the board of trustees for Angelical Press. And this evening, let's give a nice, warm welcome to Mr. Michael Mateson Miller.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here. I was going to, Father Srigo started with a prayer. I was going to start with a prayer because I like to, you get nervous before you talk, and so I want you to be as afraid of me as I'm afraid of you, all right? So I'm going to actually do a double prayer. Not that his was not efficacious, okay? But, O highest glorious God, cast your light into the darkness of my heart. Give us right faith, firm hope, perfect charity, with profound humility, with wisdom and perception, that we might do what is truly your holy will. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm happy to be here in this beautiful basement. I'm thankful to Mark Postma and Mike Tober and the Authenticum team for inviting me. Also thankful to Father Robert and Father Peter and Sacred Heart for hosting this. Delighted to be here. This is only my second Authenticum, but I've missed them all the time. And I went to the first one with Dr. Duncan Stroik, and so that's a big task to follow. I was a little bit nervous because I overheard a conversation today at the Acton Institute where I work, and someone said to Father Sirico, "Are you going to the Authenticum tonight?" He said, "Well, I'll be there in the beginning." "Oh, you're not going to stay?" He said, "Oh, I'm busy." And he walked to the next person. He goes, "I hear the lecture is really boring." So it was a little bit depressing, but you win some, you lose some. So I'm going to talk tonight a little bit about the intellectual foundations of the new evangelization. For some of you, this is going to be old hat. One of my goals in life is to never say anything original, okay? But I hope I'm going to say something that's true, all right? And so some of you are going to say, "Oh, yep, I know this." And for some of you, maybe it's going to be new. So before we talk about the intellectual foundations of the new evangelization, we should pause for a minute and ask, what do we mean by the new evangelization, right? We hear this word a lot. Now, how many people have heard the word new evangelization? Okay, how many people know what it means? Right? Not very many, right? We hear this word like, is it a new proposal? Well, I'll actually give you a quote. This is from the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. And by the way, how many of you have a handout? Okay, if you don't have a handout, please, there are handouts passed around. I made handouts. They're 5 pages, so with lots of information. And there's a quote. So the new evangelization, it says, calls us to deepen our faith, believe in the gospel message, and go forth and proclaim the gospel. The focus of the new evangelization calls Catholics to be evangelized and then go forth and evangelize. So we are to be evangelized, right, and then to go forth and evangelize. In a special way, the new evangelization is focused on re-proposing the gospel to those who have experienced a crisis of faith. So Benedict XVI called for a re-proposing of the gospel. Now, let me pause for a second. This does not mean we are to, quote unquote, make the gospel relevant. Ladies and gentlemen, the gospel is relevant. We don't have to do anything really creative. What we have to do is re-propose the truth of the gospel. And Benedict says, especially to those regions awaiting the first evangelization. So there's 2 sets. One is the new evangelization is to go out again and evangelize places that have never been evangelized, that haven't heard the name of Jesus. Right? I lived 5 years in Japan. Most people had only heard of Jesus. There are places in China and all throughout the world where the name of Jesus is not known. So that evangelization continues. But there's a second part of the new evangelization, which is to, it says, those regions where the roots of Christianity are deep, but who have experienced a serious crisis of faith due to secularization. So the new evangelization invites Catholics to renew our relationship with Jesus Christ and his church, and then re-propose the gospel. So what I'm going to focus on is this re-proposing of the gospel to those areas, Europe, the United States, Latin America, that have deep Christian tradition, but that have lost faith due to secularization, a crisis of faith. Now, the crisis of secularization has many layers. It's very complex. Anthropology, family, art, culture, marriage, technology, politics, economics, and there's layers of what it means, what secularization, how it works. What I'd like to do is focus on some of the intellectual roots of secularism and the crisis of faith. Now, a central part of the loss of faith is a crisis of the intellect. Right? That is, too often, believing and committed Christians, right? All of us, we end up thinking like secularists. Right? So our intellect is shaped by a secular world, but we're believers. And so what happens is there becomes a dichotomy, what St. James called, we almost become double-minded, right? It's like, well, religion is just a little bit in our brain, and I believe in all these things, but I don't have any intellectual formation for it. So what I'd like to do today is focus on how to think like a Christian. What does it mean to think like a Catholic? Now, let me say, that doesn't mean that all Catholics have to think the same way, lockstep, right? Good Catholics can disagree about a host of things. I mean, I see men who remind me of the Muppets, those old guys from the Muppets back in the back of the room. We don't agree on most things, right? No, I'm teasing. We actually agree on a lot of things, but there's a lot of things we disagree about, right? And that's fine because good Catholics can and do disagree about a host of things. So when I say to think like a Catholic, I don't mean to just be programmed and say, oh, this is what I must believe and walk like a robot. I mean to go deeper and say, what does it mean to really reflect upon reality like a Catholic? And this is a lifelong process. It doesn't just happen, and it's continuous. We have to check ourselves, right? So St. Paul, he says we need to be renewed in our minds, right? And I think you hear in the pontificates of John Paul II, of Benedict XVI, and of Pope Francis, this sense to be thoughtful about what it means to be a Christian. So that's what I'd like to focus on, this renewal of mind. If we're going to live like Christians and act like Christians, we also need to think like Christians. Because if we don't, then it's hard for us to live out, especially in some of the complexities of the pressures of secularism. All right, so that's the idea. And the other thing I'd like to say about this is that sometimes we get in this way of thinking that, well, there's Christianity over here, and then there's kind of science and economics and politics over here. And somehow to be a Christian isn't really related to the life of the mind. But really, if Christ is true, real, which he is, if he is the Son of God, if he died and rose again, if in him we live and move and have our being, then Christianity gives us the clearest articulation of reality. So it's not something for us to be ashamed of. It's something for us to embrace. Right? My mother-in-law always talks about reality. She loves to say the words reality. Right? I said if I were a radio show host, I'd have a it's called the Mother-in-Law Minute. It's all you can take. Okay. And she would come on and she would talk about reality, for 1 minute a week, right? Just the reality, all right? But what she's getting at is very true, that this is not something to shy away from. We are called, and Father Srico said it in the prayer, we are created in the image of God, right? In the beginning was the Logos. We are created in the image of God, Logos, reason. We are endowed with reason. And the Christian articulation of reality, the Christian articulation of what it means to be a human person is coherent and beautiful. And what you'll find, I hope, throughout my lecture, if I'm clear enough, is that the secular ideas, that the intellectual ideas that dominate much of our thinking are not coherent, even on their own terms. Even on their own terms. So, the focus of my talk is going to be on Pontiff Emeritus's, Benedict XVI's work. And I'll talk about 5 ideas or 5 crises, intellectual crises, these roots that he sees. And then what's very interesting about Benedict, I think why he's a model for the new evangelization is, first, he takes the world as it is, right? That is, he takes the crisis as it is, he deals with it on its own terms, and then he proposes the gospel. And so, in reading Benedict, a couple of years ago, I was invited to give a talk on Benedict XVI at a conference in Nashville, Tennessee. And I was reading him and studying him, and I saw this framework. I thought, wow, that's what he did. So I'm going to share, all of the ideas are Benedict's, the framework is mine. I'm going to share the framework that I discovered, that I thought, it struck me of how beautiful he takes the idea and proposes the gospel. All right, so the first kind of intellectual crisis that's at the root of secularism, I think, is very obvious to all of us. And that is the denial of truth, or what Cardinal Ratzinger called in the homily before the conclave, the dictatorship of relativism. He said, today, having a clear faith based on the creed of the church is often labeled as fundamentalism. He says, whereas relativism, that is, letting oneself be tossed here and there, carried about by every wind of doctrine, seems the only attitude that is part of modern, that can cope with modern times. Then he said, we are building a dictatorship of relativism that does not recognize anything as definitive and whose ultimate goal consists solely of one's ego and one's desires. Now, after the fall of the Soviet Union, relativism did not die. There was hope, there was a lot of excitement that after the relativism that dominated not only German National Socialism, but the communist countries, that with the fall of the Soviet Union, there would be an openness to truth. But Cardinal Ratzinger pointed out that what happened, unfortunately, is relativism mixed with a desire for gratification to form a potent mix. So what you have is this technological world, which I'll talk about in a little bit, mixed with relativism and a desire for gratification. And these things are obviously dangerous and undermine our faith, right? Because if there's no truth, the whole premise of Christianity is that it is based on the truth of Jesus Christ, crucified and risen again. So how do we deal with that? Now again, for some of you, this is all basic, but this is how the church and also how Benedict deals with it. So the first on its own terms, relativism asserts that truth does not exist. There is no truth. So let's talk for a minute about the coherence of this position. How many of you have heard people say, truth does not exist? Ever heard that? Okay, good. Some of you don't get out enough. That's good. Stay where you are. Okay. Well, if somebody says truth does not exist, there's obviously a question one can ask. You know what that question is? The question is, really, is that true? And people will say, yes, it is. I used to teach undergraduate philosophy. It was great fun. There's no truth, professor. Really? You got an F. That's not fair to you. So, truth doesn't exist. Really? Is that true? Yes. So proposition 1 is truth doesn't exist. Is that true? And the answer is, yes, it's true. Say, well, isn't that a truth? And people will say, yes, but that's the only truth. To which I'll say, really, is that true? Yes. Well, that's 2 truths. Okay, so I got it. The truth doesn't exist, and that's the truth. It's true that the truth doesn't exist, and it's the only truth that the truth doesn't exist. I mean, what's next? Are you going to become a fascist? Right? When does it end? If there's 2 truths, when do the truths keep going, right? Because remember, the joke about fascism is actually on purpose, right? Because people say, if you hold to absolute truth, you are imposing your beliefs on me. But that's not true. And that's why Benedict XVI intentionally uses the word the dictatorship of relativism. Because because relativism, ladies and gentlemen, can be nothing else but a dictatorship. Because, and John Paul talks about this in Fides et Ratio, all men by nature are philosophers. We are called to philosophos, love of wisdom. And love of wisdom, philosophos, is a pursuit of truth. And when truth is rejected, the alternative is ideology. This is why an educational system, and I'm jumping off here for a second, but this is why any educational system that rejects truth, e.g. government schools, if they reject truth, then the whole educational project is compromised. Because education is primarily about philosophos, love of wisdom. And when love of wisdom and truth are eradicated, education can be nothing else but ideology. And this is why it's a dictatorship. Whereas truth, because it's open, searching, and conforming the mind to reality. Okay, St. Thomas has a beautiful definition of truth. Truth is the conformation, the conforming of the mind to reality. Truth is conforming the mind to reality. And because of that, it's not ideological. Right? It must be open. And relativism must and can be nothing but ideological and therefore a dictatorship. So the first one, okay, it's the only truth. So the problem is, and I have this summarized in your handout, right? So then what people say is, okay, fine. Truth, maybe truth exists. But you can't know the truth. Really? So do you know that? Absolutely, I'm certain. Okay, so you're absolutely certain that you know the truth, that you know that truth doesn't exist, right? So you see that the inherent problem, it is an incoherent position. It is self-refuting on its own terms, right? Now, so ladies and gentlemen, on its own terms, relativism is incoherent. Let me be clear. Just because the truth exists, which it does, and that you can know it, which you can, doesn't mean you do. You might not. And that's why in front of truth, in front of reality and truth requires reverence. Truth requires reverence. Because man is not the measure of all things. Man conforms himself to reality. Right? Joseph Pieper, the great German philosopher. How many of you have read Joseph Pieper? All right. Woo-hoo. Okay. Pieper says that prudence, right? Prudence is seeing the world as it is and acting accordingly. And that requires reverence, right? So the truth and reverence are related. All right. All right. So here's the problem. So he deals with the questions of truth and how it's incoherent on its own term. But in the homily, what does he do? He says there's a dictatorship of relativism. Then he says, but how does he respond to the dictatorship of relativism? He says, we, however, have a different goal. The Son of God, true man. He is the measure of true humanism. An adult faith is not a faith that follows the trends of fashion and the latest novelty. A mature adult faith is deeply rooted in friendship with Christ. It is this friendship which opens us up to all that is good and gives a criterion by which to distinguish the true from the false and deceit from truth. So first, deals with truth on his own terms, then he proposes the answer. And the answer to relativism is the truth himself, the person of Jesus Christ. In him we live and move and have our being. The second crisis is the crisis of reason. Now, this Benedict XVI, and prior to his election as Pope, as Cardinal Ratzinger, he'd been writing about for many years. But this is most notably addressed in what's called the Regensburg Address. The Holy Father gave this in Regensburg in Germany. And you may remember this speech because the Muslim world got very upset and they were blowing up things afterwards, okay? And so it caused a lot of press. But really, the press missed that the speech was really directed to the West. Okay, it was directed to the West. It was saying we are in a crisis of reason. And a crisis of reason is a crisis of politics, which is a crisis of humanity. Okay? And he says, look, why? Because what is politics about? What is politics about? Politics, the end of politics is justice. Problem is that in the modern concept of reason, we have limited reason to the empirical. We have limited reason to the empirical, which means if something, okay, how many people follow that? We have limited reason to the empirical. Anybody confused? It's okay if you are. Okay. That means in order for something to be reasonable, it needs to be this long, this high, made of wood, made of plastic, made of metal, etc. You can measure it, okay? We have limited reason to the empirical. And if it's not demonstrable, if you can't empirically demonstrate it, then it's not reasonable. It's relegated outside the realm of reason, okay? This is the dominant understanding of reason since at least Francis Bacon. That in order for something to be rational, it must be empirical and measurable, all right? Now, there are a couple of problems with this. Okay, the first one is that it doesn't hold on its own terms. It doesn't hold on its own terms. Think about it. Here's how it doesn't hold. People will say, okay, in order for you to prove something and be reasonable, you need to demonstrate it to me empirically, okay? Okay, fair enough. You hold that reason is only empirical. Fair enough. Demonstrate that to me empirically. Okay, now, ladies and gentlemen, this is not word games. These are being games. This is not semantics. It's about being. The position is, in order for something to be reasonable, it must be empirical. You cannot demonstrate that empirically, which means on its own terms, the empiricist rational position does not hold. In fact, you're using a different type of logical reasoning even to make your argument, even though you've rejected it. Okay, but there's another problem, and this is why it's a crisis of humanity and a crisis of politics. The end of politics is what? Justice. Well, justice, ladies and gentlemen, isn't empirical. Neither is goodness, beauty, truth, friendship, hope, love, compassion, pity. All of these things, these fundamental human things in life, are not empirical. And they have been relegated outside the realm of reason to become nothing but raw emotion. And what happens, it vitiates man. Okay, it reduces man. Now, if I had more time, which is a whole other lecture, talk about what C.S. Lewis, how many of you read The Abolition of Man? Okay, this is a great book. You have to read The Abolition of Man. Okay, it's especially read Men Without Chests. What I will do is I have a website. At my website, it's michaelmathesonmiller.com. That's my name. Okay, I'll put a reading list. Okay, so you don't even have to worry about writing it down. But Abolition of Man, Men Without Chests. It's 15 pages. Okay, and it's really about this. What happens when all of the fundamental things in life are separated from reason? What Lewis says, we lose the capacity for reasonable emotions, what Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, calls spiritual emotions. Right? So love is not merely a raw emotion or passion. Love is not merely a chemical reaction. Love is not merely hormones. Love is a reasonable emotion. What Wojtyła, John Paul, calls a spiritual emotion. And what the late German philosopher Dietrich von Hildebrand, because he's German, calls intelligible spiritual affectivity. Okay, that's one word, all right, for Germans. For any of you who study German, that's one word. Okay, so, but what happens, it goes through the intellect in conjunction with the will, and you say yes. So when St. Thomas says you make an act of, love as an act of the will, that's not boring. That's unbelievably exciting and beautiful, because it doesn't mean your little tiny will's like, oh yes, I don't really like you very much, but I'm making an act of the will. No, it's a full, complete gift of self. But what happens is when we reduce reason to the empirical, that's gone. And it's a crisis of politics, because now you can't talk about justice. And if politics is not about justice, ladies and gentlemen, then what is politics about? It's about power. And we are returned back to Plato's Thrasymachus, that's the bad guy in the Republic, who says that justice is the rule of the stronger. Justice is the rule of the stronger. All right. Now, I'm going to pause for a minute and go back to justice being the rule of the stronger in a second. And I'm going to say, how did we get here? Okay, so I'm going to return you, ladies and gentlemen, back to 5th grade. Are you ready to go back to 5th grade? This is what happens. Do you remember in 5th grade when you took a critical thinking exercise? I'm going to give one to you now. It's on your sheet, but you're smart enough to follow me. Here we go. I'm going to say sentences, and you're going to tell me whether they are facts or opinions. Are these sentences facts or opinions? Okay? Johann Sebastian Bach was born in 1685. Johann Sebastian Bach wrote beautiful music. Pope Pius XII was the Bishop of Rome. Pope Pius XII was a good pope. Bell-bottoms were popular in the 70s. Bell-bottoms are cool. Murder is bad. See what just happened? Now, what happened to the 5th grader is that all value judgments are opinions. And all empirical statements are fact. So, what's not put in the mind, the murder is bad is never said, but you followed it. If all those other value judgments are opinion, then why is murder is bad not opinion? So what happens is Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, they're all turned on their head. This is in homeschooling textbooks. It's in Christian textbooks. One time I went home, my wife said, look at this. And my 5th grader was doing an exercise of critical thinking. I said, no, are you kidding me? Okay, there it was. We were laughing about it. Right here I am going out to talk about it, to come home like in my own house. It's like this critical thinking exercise. So he got a big spanking. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just teasing Holy Father Francis. Okay, he told us not to do that. All right, but ladies and gentlemen, look, Bach did write beautiful music. It's a fact. Pius XII was a good pope, and bell-bottoms are not cool. Okay? These are facts. The problem is that there's two problems. One, the opposite of a fact is not an opinion. The opposite of a fact is a false proposition. Opinions are true or false, are good or bad, depending on whether they're justified or not. Right? So the problem is everything is mixed up. And so C.S. Lewis has this beautiful line. He says that it's not a theory they put into his mind, but an assumption, which 10 years hence, its presence unconscious, will condition him to take a side in a controversy that he has never recognized as a controversy at all. He says the authors, maybe they don't know what they're doing to him, and the boy cannot know what is being done to him. And what's being done to him is his patrimony and his humanity is being removed, surgically removed. And that's why Lewis says we create men without chests. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. We create men without chest. We remove the capacity because of an incoherent, limited, reductionist understanding of reason that limits reason to the empirical. But A, it's incoherent on its own terms, and B, it's bad for you. It's harmful to your soul. And many Christians, like extremely godly people, are operating under empiricist rational assumptions. And part of the new evangelization and fight and the loss of faith is to renew the mind. So let me get back to politics for a second. Politics, and why? Because it's justice. This is an example. So politics is about justice. And Cardinal Ratzinger writes, quote, politics is in the realm of reason. Not merely technological calculating reason, but moral reason. Since the goal of the state and ultimately the goal of politics has a moral nature, which is peace and justice. So as I said, when you limit all the empirical question, when you limit reason to the empirical, all the fundamental human questions are are gone. And I said, we return back to Plato's Thrasymachus. Justice is the right of the stronger. But Ratzinger says, no. Okay, sorry, that's what I meant to say. Justice is the right of the stronger. Now, in our modern context, justice is the right of the stronger becomes consensus makes right. But Ratzinger says, quote, the majority cannot be the ultimate principle, since there are values that no majority is entitled to annul. It can never be right to kill innocent persons, and no power can make this legitimate. Here, too, what is ultimately at stake is the defense of reason. Think about it. Now you understand why he says it, if you didn't understand before. Here he is talking about majorities can't annul. You can't, like an abortion, you can't kill innocent persons. And what's ultimately at stake? The defense of reason. Reason, that is moral reason, is above the majority. Now, how is reason purified, right? Remember that encyclical, Fides et Ratio, faith and reason. Just as Jesus Christ is the answer to truth, the dictatorship of relativism, the problem of truth, so faith is the answer to the crisis of reason. Faith purifies and heals reason. Why? Because Jesus Christ is truth. He is also logos and agape. And faith heals reason. He says faith can illuminate reason. He said, and this is very important, in the last century, it was the testimony of the martyrs that limited the excess of power. It was the testimony of the martyrs that limited the excess of the power. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, you had to stand up to all the lies. And by a martyr standing up to the lies of the 20th century totalitarian regimes, even if he died, he stood up to the excess of power because he showed its abuse. And Cardinal Ratzinger writes, thus making a decisive contribution to the convalescence of reason. In Spe Salvi, he says, reason only becomes truly human when it is open to the saving forces of faith and when it looks beyond itself. So faith and reason are deeply connected. And I would leave that to there, and then you can meditate on those things. The third crisis is a crisis of progress. Progress has become an idol. Okay, we're Americans, we know that. When I go to Europe, one of the things I like to say to Europeans, just to get them a little bit riled, they're worried, and I say, don't worry, it's okay, I'm American, I'll solve your problems. Okay? To which they think, we knew it. We knew they think that way, right? And the English are like, oh, you don't have a sense of sarcasm at all. No. Oh, no, not at all. Okay, so we love progress, especially in the West, and progress has become an idol. Right? There's a myth of progress. We think we can solve all problems, right? And think about it, like, you know, there's the comedian that makes the jokes like, you know, why can't you do that? We can get men to the moon. You know, people make jokes, why can't this be done? Like, and we get frustrated when we don't understand when something's wrong because this progress, we think we can accomplish things. Now, Cardinal Ratzinger says progress is not wrong in all sense. I mean, it's fine. Progress is good. In fact, the whole concept of progress and the linear conception of time comes out of the Jewish and Christian traditions, right? So it's part of our tradition. The problem is progress has become an idol, all right? And politics built on a false concept of progress are illusory, and he says ultimately deny human freedom and deny man himself. So progress gets unhinged from morality. It's no longer about what I ought to do, it's only what I can do. And what I ought to do is not part of it. So in Spe Salvi, how many of you have read Spe Salvi? Okay, I'm going to tell you. And those of you who've read it can maybe join in if you agree. Spe Salvi, I think, is my favorite thing that Benedict XVI wrote. It is so beautiful. It's a beautiful meditation on suffering and love and hope. I highly recommend it. I mean, it's wonderful for Lent. It's you know, sometimes you're like, oh, an encyclical, that's going to be exciting, okay? This one really is a beautiful encyclical. I highly recommend it. And I'll put that up also on my website. So he says in Spe Salvi, modern concepts of progress derive from the limitation of reason. Oh, we're back to reason again. And a new correlation between science and praxis, right? And the idea that we can restore paradise, we can create heaven on earth not through faith, but through work, through reason, science, and politics. All right, and C.S. Lewis also writes, have you read That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis? Okay, he talks about this here as well. All right, so progress then gets mixed with our technological world, and it becomes something that we end up worshiping. But this is the point, and somebody said this, I thought it was very beautiful. When you worship an idol, what does the idol take? When you worship an idol, what does the idol take? The idol takes your children. The idol always takes your children. The false god takes your children. And the false god of technology will take our children if we worship the false god. I thought it was I heard somebody say that, I thought it was absolutely right on. So, what is the answer to progress? Well, the answer to progress that Benedict gives is Christian hope. Right? Progress is not wrong in all respects, but progress alone, we cannot create heaven on earth. Every time we try to create heaven on earth, millions of people die. So progress has to be tempered, he says. It's tempered and purified by hope. And hope, we know, is the confident expectation that Jesus Christ will deliver us. Right? Now, it's interesting. Sometimes, Protestants will ask Catholics, are you saved? And Catholics will say, I hope so. And sometimes, we scandalize Protestants when we say stuff like that. Like, you hope so. I mean, don't you have confidence you're saved? You're like, yes, because hope is the confident expectation that Jesus Christ will deliver me, right? Our salvation is in our hope in Jesus Christ, right? So what we find is that the idea of progress needs to be moderated by a reflection on the last things, on death, judgment, heaven, and hell. Ratzinger says, within this human history of ours, the absolutely ideal situation will never exist, and a perfect ordering of freedom will never be achieved. The myth of the liberated world, of the future in which everything is different and everything is false, everything is good, is false. He said, every other eschatological promise within history fails to liberate us. Rather, it disappoints us and therefore enslaves us. Because we are not called to put our faith in man or in science, but in Jesus Christ. And he says, and so we reflect on these ideas, and this is where hope plays the role in tempering progress. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are not supposed to be opposed to progress. Progress is fine. Penicillin is wonderful. Dentistry, wonderful. Even the iPhone, not so bad. Okay? Right? But our faith is not there. Right? He says, in Space Solvi, the right state of human affairs, the moral well-being of the world, can never be guaranteed through structure alone. Right? It's always in this relationship with Jesus Christ. Right? So he says in Space Solvi, in place of the myth of progress which enslaves us, we need Christian hope. All right? So hope purifies progress. The fourth crisis is the crisis of freedom. Now, this is pretty obvious, right? In Truth and Tolerance, which is a wonderful book, Joseph Ratzinger, Truth and Tolerance, he says, freedom is the dominant theme of modernity. Everybody wants to talk about freedom. Everybody wants to talk about freedom, but nobody wants to talk about truth. He says, but if we can ask what freedom is, then we should be able to ask, if we can ask what truth is, we should be able to ask what freedom is. All right? Now, again, the crisis of freedom is intrinsically related to the crisis of reason and truth. Okay, why? Because when freedom is separated from truth and reason, it becomes what Cardinal Ratzinger calls a diabolical freedom. All right? It becomes a mere raw exercise of the will. Okay? Now, again, listen to it on its own terms. Freedom, the modern concept, is merely an exercise of my will. I'm just going to exercise my will. But, ladies and gentlemen, an irrational will is not a free will. If I said, ladies and gentlemen, I'm so thankful to be here at Authenticum. I appreciate it. Very nice to be here. And I started banging my head on the end of the corner of this table and blood was like spurting out and everything. Would you look at me and think, wow, that guy is free? Whoa. No, you'd think I was crazy. You'd think I'd lost my mind, right? Because an irrational will is not a free will. Freedom must be connected to truth and reason for it to be fully human. It must be oriented to truth. So, what is freedom for, is the question. Right? Everybody loves freedom. And this was the question at the fall of the Berlin Wall. We finally have freedom. People would come. We finally have freedom. What's it for? What am I supposed to do with it? Ricardo Ratzinger says, 2 themes have always accompanied me in my life. The theme of Christ, the living, present God. The God who loves us and heals us through suffering. And on the other hand, the theme of love, the key to Christianity. Man is not redeemed by science or progress or the perfect ordering of the state. Man is redeemed by love. The end of freedom, the goal of freedom, is for love. And of course, those of you who've read John Paul II, right, know this, that we are called to give ourselves in self-donation to others and to God. So freedom is not, first of all, freedom on its own, this radical nominalist concept of freedom, is not only incoherent on its own terms, it has no end. And the end, the answer, is love. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the crisis of faith is deeply related to the crisis of freedom. People want freedom. We're made by God to be free. And in this beautiful book called The Sign of Contradiction, which is the retreat that John Paul II gave to Pope Paul VI, he talks about the denial of God. And the denial of God, right in the beginning, when the devil tempts Adam and Eve, the denial of God is related to freedom. And in the modern context, this idea of this, what's called the state of nature, and some of this might be a little complex, but don't worry, you can ask me in Q&A. With Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, who say man is just this individual who just kind of pops out of nowhere. He's in the state of nature. Cardinal Wojtyła says, this asks the fundamental question: is man alone, and does his greatness require it, and thereby rejects God? Or is man lonely? In the beginning, Adam and Eve are in the garden. Adam is in the garden. And he's given all the animals in front of him. And he has to name them all, but he's unsatisfied. Remember, he's unsatisfied. So God puts him into a deep sleep, and he creates Eve. And he puts Eve in front of him. And what does Adam say? At last. At last. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. At last. Cardinal Scola, in his book, The Nuptial Mystery, talks about how what Adam sees is identity and difference. Identity and difference. And in that identity and difference is a call to communion. And that call to communion is sublime because the two become one. But even in itself, it's not sublime enough because another subject that God wills for its own sake is brought into being. Notice, children are not for the parents. Children are ends in themselves. Children aren't choices. We chose to have a child. See, even the language is disordered because children are subjects willed by God for their own sake with an eternal destiny. And then the devil comes and he tempts them. Wojtyła says he couldn't tempt them with radical atheism because they were religious, right? Religio. The modern man is tempted with radical atheism. But he says he turned them to the world and away from God. And then what happened? The identity and difference, the difference came in front and it masked the identity. And Adam turned Eve into an object for his own gratification. And Eve turned Adam into an object. And that's why God gives us not only the natural gift of marriage, but the sacrament of marriage, which is a remedy for concupiscence. It does not mean it's an outlet for something. It means it's a healing remedy for concupiscence. That is, through self-donative gifting. Over time. Concupiscence, remember, is the effects on original sin. Right? The effects of original sin. It's what makes us like St. Paul says, I do what I hate and I don't do what I want. And the remedy of marriage, the remedy of concupiscence, enables that difference to be back where it belongs. So that Adam and Eve, that the husband and wife see each other as subjects in an intersubjective relationship. What Martin Buber calls I-thou, or better, even an I-I relationship. The world is trying to use its freedom, especially its sexual freedom, to find love, to find meaning. Right? But it cannot find it apart from reason, truth, and using freedom ultimately for love. In part of our reproposing of the gospel, I'm not talking about tactics, I'm only talking about the intellectual foundations. But do not discount the effects of love and freedom and what it means. And I give you one piece of evidence. If you think it's all, well, it's not going to work. And that piece of evidence is many of you, first of all, your own hearts. And second of all, that piece of evidence is Pope John Paul or St. John Paul. Okay? When he came to the United States, the bishop said, this is for you World Youth Day. Nobody's going to come. The bishops, nobody's going to come. Okay? I mean, he's an old guy coming over here, and he's like, sexually repressed and all this kind of stuff. Okay? So he came in his helicopter flying over Denver. If you might have read about this, he's flying into Denver Stadium in the 90s. And the helicopter started shaking because, I think it was 70,000 people in Denver Stadium were chanting, JP2, we love you. JP2, we love you. And it created sound waves that actually shook the helicopter, or like a war. Okay? And all of these young people came out to see this old guy. And as he got older and more beat up, more people came. And he said things like, you shouldn't be doing that. And we said, you're right, I'll stop. And he said, don't do this because that's not what love is. And all these people said, yes. And he transformed lives. And there are babies alive precisely because of his words, because he proclaimed the gospel. So don't think that reproposing love doesn't have an effect. Because, and this is, go back to what Cardinal Ratzinger says, friendship with Jesus Christ, right, through suffering who redeems us. So freedom is for love. And in Deus Caritas Est, which you should also read, he says, love will always provide necessary. There will always be a need for love. All right, the fifth one, and the final crisis that I'll talk about is the crisis of beauty. Now, when beauty is reduced merely to the subjective, and this is the basic idea, most people think beauty is in the eye of the beholder. How many people think beauty is in the eye of the beholder? It's fine, you can be wrong. I'm just teasing. No. Don't be, no. People think beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? And because it's partially true. But we've taken a partial truth and we've made it an absolute truth. It is true that we experience beauty differently. So in one sense, it's true. But what we've done is we've reduced beauty merely to the subjective. And we've undermined objective beauty. It's also related, you can see, to truth and reason, right? So this has profound effect on morality, on politics, and on liturgy. But it also does something else. It rips the chest out of the person. It dehumanizes the person. Because it takes this sublime insight, this sublime truth, that each of us has a unique insight and experience into beauty, into a piece of art, a piece of music, a landscape. If I'm listening to Bach's cello suites, and I'm not a cellist, okay? I'm an extremely bad violinist, all right? My hope is to become a bad violinist. I'm just terrible right now, okay? And I'm sitting there with a cellist. He can tell me something that I don't know. If somebody has gone through great suffering and conversion, and they're listening to a piece of music or listening to a painting, or looking at a painting or listening to a piece of music, they're going to experience things that I'm not going to experience. And I'm going to experience things that you're not going to experience. And this is the beauty of human communication of the soul. I'm able to see something and experience it different from you. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm missing something. But it's in this communication, right, that the soul grows. How many times are we moved? Like, well, I didn't think that was beautiful. If you don't think Bach's music is beautiful, you're wrong. No, I'm totally confident to say that. It just means that your aesthetic sensibilities aren't developed sufficiently, right? And that you like something doesn't mean that it's beautiful. I mean, there's a reason why teenagers like rock and roll, okay? Not because it's beautiful, because they've got all these hormones inside of them. They're all excited about stuff, like Moon. Oh yeah, she's super cute. Check this out. Oh my goodness. Of course. Speaks right to your heart. You're like, feel it. I feel it. I've always liked rock and roll. I never stop. Okay. So, but what it does, it takes this beautiful, unique person that someone comes with their hopes, their dreams, their wants, their sufferings, and they come in front of a piece of music or art. And it takes that, and they experience it differently. It takes it and it reduces it to the most banal thing, like, well, everybody's got their own opinion. That's boring. What if my opinions are dumb? I mean, how else are we going to grow in our wisdom and stature before God and man if we don't listen to other people? Right? The right people. Okay? So what's happened is the crisis of beauty has led to a proliferation of ugliness, crassness, obscenity, pornography, violence, disregard for women and children, and disregard for life itself. There's a fantastic essay by the English philosopher named Roger Scruton called The Desecration of Beauty. Beauty, instead of being something, and I won't go into aesthetics, but it's an act, like an act of the will directed towards beauty. Art, instead of being an act of the will directed towards beauty that's intelligible, art is merely raw self-expression. Okay? So it's a bad concept of freedom applied to art. And you know what you get? Neo-expressionism. Have you ever seen neo-expressionism? It's disaster. You know what else you get? Okay. So I highly recommend you read The Desecration of Beauty, and there's another article by Scruton on kitsch. I'll put it up on the website. Roger Scruton. I'll put it up on its website, okay? It's michaelmathesonmiller.com. Okay. So, in response, and I'm going to conclude with this. Benedict offers a Catholic understanding of beauty, instantiated in the liturgy and the sacraments. And he says, and I have a long quote, but it's in your thing. The only really effective apologia for Christianity comes down to two arguments. Namely, the saints the church has produced and the art which has grown in her womb. Better witness is borne to the Lord by the splendor of holiness and art than by clever excuses which apologetics has come up with to justify the dark sides, which sadly are so frequent in the church's human history. If the church is to continue to transform and humanize the world, how can she dispense with the beauty in her liturgies, the beauty which is so closely linked with radiance of the resurrection? No, Christians must not be too satisfied. They must make their church into a place where beauty and hence truth is at home. Beauty and hence truth. St. Thomas Aquinas says beauty, truth, and goodness are actually all the same. They're all aspects of being. Beauty, truth, and goodness. Without this, the world will become the first circle of hell. End quote. This is very powerful. This is from the greatest theologian of our day. The only really effective apologia for Christianity comes down to two arguments. The saints the church has produced and the art which has grown in her womb. I went to a funeral on Tuesday. Someone I didn't know very well. Some of you might have known him, and I went there. I parked like a quarter of a mile away. The place was packed. Okay, Deacon Ken Baldwin. And I only met him once or twice, and I knew his son a little bit. And I walked up, and I thought, oh my goodness. I've been reading Herodotus on like what makes a good life, right? And what makes a good life is you have to see the end. In the end, here's this man with thousands of people coming to celebrate his funeral. And the priest said, if you think that one person who loves Jesus Christ can't make a difference, look around you. It was very powerful. In my homily, there'll be like my family, another family, and some guy for the food. Okay? So but it was very powerful. And I was moved by it. And the question, and they describe, you know what he did? He loved God, he loved family, and he took care of the poor. And it's the saints that call us, right? It is the beauty of holiness. There's another book by John Sayward called The Beauty of Holiness and the Holiness of Beauty. It is beauty which attracts us. The beauty of holiness, the beauty of liturgy, the beauty of our patrimony. So, if you look at the last box, all the things I've told you are Joseph Ratzinger. But as I was working through this is what I found. To the crises that underlie secularism and underlie the loss of faith, the crisis of relativism, the crisis of truth, the crisis of reason, the crisis of progress, the crisis of freedom, and the crisis of beauty, Pope Benedict offers us Jesus Christ, faith, hope, love, and worship. So the intellectual foundations are a part, they're not all, they're a part of the new evangelization. If we do not think like Catholics, if we do not think like Christians and get evangelized, we cannot repropose the gospel to a world that is in dire need of it. So I conclude with one thought, and that is the book of The Soul of the Apostolate by Dom Chotard. If you haven't read it, it's great. He says, if you're going to have an apostolate, which we all have, you have to have an interior life. You must have a prayer life. You have to have an interior life, because without an interior life, it says 3 things happen. 1, you will crash and burn. 2, you will not be as effective. And 3, Jesus Christ wants to be at the center. Because as the Protestant theologian Dallas Willard said, this is not my kingdom, it's God's kingdom. And I think Benedict XVI and John Paul and Pope Francis are giving us a vision that we must recapture our patrimony. Take seriously what it means to renew our minds so that we can repropose the gospel to the world that is in a crisis of faith. Thank you for your time. Do whatever you want. Sure. Yes, sir. No. Next.
First, thank you very much for your time and very well spoken. My question, geez, like right in the. Okay. My question is, all the points that you made were very well spoken, very logical, and very convincing. I refer to Pope Francis when he talks about how, as we go about this new evangelization, we are to entice people, or rather than proselytization, we draw people in by attraction. So my question, I suppose, is to a world that doesn't even realize it's sick, let alone suffering and dying. How do you, what would some practical ways of bringing about, per se, these points and get them in an environment where they would be able to receive and be more effective in their spreading of the new evangelization?
That's a very good question, and I'll take a stab at it, but I mean, part of it is, it's complex. I would say, first of all, that I think the point that you made of Pope Francis with attraction is very important. And I think to be winsome is important. To know your audience is important. I took some guesses because I've been to Authenticum and I know some people, so I took somewhat of a guess. I mean, there may be people here who are like, it was not the right tone for the audience. But generally, especially in where conversion takes place, is in friendship, because essentially it's about friendship with Jesus Christ, right? I mean, Aristotle writes about the importance of friendship, seeking after the good. So I think being winsome being, and I say that loving and kind in a Christian way. That is telling the truth in charity, not compromising, taking a stand, living for your beliefs the best you can. When you fail, say you're sorry. Doing your examinations of conscience, so you're trying to be in relationship with God, having a deep interior life. And having a deep, I'm going to say just a second. I'm going to move back for a second because I'm going to go back. If I forget interior life, you got to remind me interior life. Okay? So I'm going to say, yes, you're right in one sense. People don't know that they're sick. Well, we all don't know, right? That's why the Psalms say, save me, save me from my hidden faults, right? Lord, let me know myself, right? And so part of the process of closeness to God is actually in getting to know Jesus, as John Paul II loved to say, Christ reveals man to himself. And so, but the world, everybody's always in crisis, right? Everybody is seeking after the good, the true, and the beautiful. Everybody, right? There's no secularist out there who's not seeking after the good, the true, and the beautiful, because we're created in the image of God with reason. We are made with an eternal destiny to donate ourselves to God in a self-donative relationship. And our intellects are directed towards the truth. Our wills are directed towards the good. We have what Thomas you'd call a Thomistic, like a dynamic essence. We're not just sitting there. We are moving somewhere, and we are moving to God. And, think of what is Chesterton, or I think it's apocryphal Chesterton. It's like the young man knocking at the brothel is looking for God. Everybody's looking for God. Everybody. So that's the first thing. You're looking for God, so are they. They just don't know it. So this goes to your question. What do? We attract them to God. How do we do that? We beat the tar out of them. No, I'm kidding. Okay. Let's see if you're listening. Okay, no. I think winsomeness, but attraction. But here's, I think, the key. There's no secret recipe to attracting people to God except this: friendship with Jesus Christ. Because what people want is not you. They don't care about you. They want Jesus Christ. And if you can present to them in some unconscious way Jesus Christ, they will come. And you've all had this experience. I've had this experience. When my prayer life is rich, doesn't happen very often. Okay, but when my prayer life is rich, I was praying. Let me give you a story. Prayer life was rich. 2 stories. I was in Austria years ago. Someone came up to me and they started talking about their problems. My best friend, we were together. And we started talking to the lady about her problems. And both of us were praying a lot that time. All these other guys are like, "Whoa, that was weird." And we're like, that wasn't weird at all. It happens to us all the time, right? When my prayer life is like that, it happens. Okay? I was in Austria once. Okay, I was in Spain. I was praying. I was living in Spain for a while, and I was praying all the time. I mean, I can hardly speak Spanish because I had people come up to me constantly. I'd have dinner and they'd start crying, telling me their problems. Like men, serious men, like, "Oh, this is a struggle I have." This lady followed me and I kept talking to her. Finally, I was like, "Okay, I got to go," right? She was asking me questions. They weren't looking for me. I'm obnoxious. Ask my wife. Okay? So then, this is just a couple years ago, I was praying the Jesus prayer, like, "Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me. Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me." I was praying. I'm giving you a simple example. I was praying, "Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me." I was super tired. I said, "I'm going to get up and I'm going to go to church," even though I didn't want to. I went up and got to church. I was praying, "Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me." I went to go get my hair cut in this place in Vienna. I like Vienna. So, and this guy starts talking to me. "Oh, what are you doing here?" "I'm giving lectures and stuff." He starts asking me questions. So he goes, "Can I buy you a cup of tea?" So we go out of the haircut place, and he buys me a cup of tea. I was sitting there listening to him. I had a little bit of time. Okay, and he kept asking me questions. I mean, all of you have stories like this, but the point is, right? And so then he starts telling me about, like, his sins. I don't want to know about his sins. Go tell Father Peter your sins, okay? Confession. You go into a room, a little black box with somebody you know, and tell them all the bad things you've done. I mean, What a great idea. Okay, so I said, so he's telling me things, and he was asking me questions, philosophical questions, and then it hit me. I said, look, he told me stories, crazy stories about like these miracles that were happening, and I said, listen to me. Jesus Christ is calling you to himself. Go in front of the Blessed Sacrament. Make an act of the will. Go to confession and give him your life. Okay? But the reason, and I realize, the only reason that these things, I have lots of stories like this, like everybody does. It's when my prayer life is good. When my prayer life is not good, people don't come talk to me. It's annoying. So you don't want to pray sometimes, like, I'm not praying today. People leave me alone, right? People, like, when I'm busy, I don't pray because I don't want anybody to bother me. No, I'm kidding. All right. But I'm dead serious, and you know this experience. When your prayer life is rich, people don't care about you. They see Jesus Christ. That's what attracts them. That's what Cardinal Ratzinger's last point is. It is the holiness of the saints. It is your authentic seeking after the gospel, even when you fail, that will pull people to Jesus Christ. There's no tactic, there's no trick, there's nothing else but holiness. Holiness and beauty are attractive. If you live a life of holiness and beauty, people will flock around you just like they did Deacon Ken Baldwin. Let me tell you, I hardly knew him. The Burmese community was there. Okay, this is serious. So the long answer to that question is friendship with Jesus Christ will attract people and convert people. Full stop. Sorry, next question. I should have said that in the beginning. I think out loud. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. That's a good question. That's a problem. I think it's a serious problem. Yeah. Oh, the question was, in the quote by Cardinal Ratzinger, was, she said, I hadn't read this before, and it struck me, okay, the witness of saints and the beauty of the church. We have a lot of modern saints. What about, is there a lot of beauty? Where's the modern kind of beauty that's attractive? And I think that's actually a serious problem. I would say one place is here, at Sacred Heart, where you have beautiful liturgy. I think it's a problem, but we do have a patrimony of beautiful churches and beautiful art that we can get access to now in a way that in the past you couldn't because of the internet and because of music. You can find beautiful pieces of art, a beautiful work. There are some modern artists who are doing some things. Two of them, one is a man named David Clayton, an Englishman who's an iconographer, and he's doing some interesting things. Another man named Henry Wingate's a friend of mine who's doing portrait stuff. And there's a resurgence of Duncan Stroik, who is here, who's doing beautiful architecture. I've heard of, there's some people doing stained glass. There's a resurgence in sacred music. There is something going on. It's a little harder to find at this point, but the patrimony and the accessibility of beautiful things it is so democratized in the good sense of the word, not in the Tocquevillian sense of the word, is that you can just get access to things that you could never do before. And I think part of what beauty, like holiness, is actually hard, right? So my children are learning the violin, and they say to me, "Daddy, violin is hard." And I say, "No, it's not. It's excruciatingly difficult." Okay? And you're in a process of incremental learning. And so it's okay. And I think that one is to go back to the patrimony, to look around. There's actually some interesting modern poets, but the Norton Anthology of Poetry, there's unbelievably beautiful things there. And part of it is, I think, to recover that. And I think maybe what has to happen, and this is just thinking out loud, is as these kind of things like Authenticum come, I think one of the things this is just me and my speculation. One of the things I see is there's a lot of wonderful, I get to travel a lot, or I have to travel a lot. And I see a lot of communities that are flourishing and groups of people doing wonderful things. And there's been intellectual development, there's theological catechesis, the theology of the body, all these things. The latter thing, the thing that's coming at the end is art and music. But it's starting to come up too. And I think part of it is, if you want beauty, you need to make effort, right? It requires real sacrifice and effort, just like holiness does. And I think that part of it is from the catechesis, from the work of John Paul and Benedict and all the things that so many people are doing, like Authenticum, the next generation, the art will come, right? Because it reflects the spiritual condition of the people. Art, like politics, reflects the spiritual condition of the people. And so, but I think, so I'm not giving a great answer, but I would say, I'll try to put some resources up on the site, and I'll think about them and put some more up later. And I'm going to think more about your question. I don't have a great answer, but I'll work on one. Okay?
One more question.
Sir.
You said that the goal of politics is justice,
The end of politics, yes, sir.
the end. That has the advantage of being neat, but I have been thinking about it too. Can't come up with any tidy answer like that, but I was thinking that the ultimate goal of a political society would be to maximize the potential for people to achieve the best that they can in their human nature. And that justice would be, of course, an element of that, a necessary element, but that it is, it's not enough.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir. That's a very good question. I think an important one, and I'll try to give a short-winded answer. So one is, what I think you're getting to is something very important, that the goal of politics is justice and peace. Okay, so bear with me for a second. The goal of politics, right? Politics coming from the Greek word polis, meaning city. The goal of politics is justice and peace. And you say, well, isn't the goal of politics what we could call human flourishing, enabling each person to live out in a human flourishing way according to their nature? And that's the goal of man, to love and serve God here on earth and live with him forever in heaven. Christianity is primarily concerned about saving souls, getting souls to heaven. It's also concerned with helping to create the conditions that enable human flourishing. Okay? And so if you, especially in the liturgy, the Eastern liturgy is the Eastern Rite liturgy, and probably Orthodox, but the Eastern Rite liturgy is clear about this. May we live in peace to have these opportunities. So for example, and I won't go into too much of this, but it allows me to be a capitalist. I actually talk about these things in a video series called Poverty Cure, and there are some of them on the back table. So I actually forgot them. That's how bad a capitalist I am. I was like, I forgot them. So a colleague brought them over. So if you're interested, we have special discount rates, and there are 6 steak knives that get thrown in. Okay, but back to this. So politics, and I'll try to give it short, but the purpose of politics is justice and peace. And politics is one element that creates a certain framework. There's certain institutions of justice. For example, a very important institution of justice is private property. Another one is rule of law, right? Private property we know is presupposed in the Decalogue, in the 10 Commandments. It's talked about seriously in Genesis 23. It's in the church fathers and doctors. Rerum Novarum talks about it, and I'll go back to Rerum Novarum in a second. Okay, rule of law is another one. This is justice, rule of law, not rule of men. And so Thomas Aquinas talks about rule of law, right? And there's other things. Free association, right? St. Thomas Aquinas, 1256, in Contra Impugnates, makes the first case against monopoly rights and for free association. Free exchange, the ability to exchange things without undue burden, right? These you see in the scholastics, all right? A certain moral ecology. These are parts of justice without the state going in, all right? So let's take private property. What's the purpose of private property? Now, most people will make economic reasons for private property. It's more efficient, et cetera, et cetera. Sure, fine, okay? I've got Dr. Barrows over there. He's like, oh, you could maximize this, he's right. So, all right, so he's an economist, all right? So there's lots of economic arguments for private property. It's highly efficient, et cetera. But go to Rerum Novarum, and he's talking about private property, and then he pauses for a second, and he starts talking about the family. Well, why is he talking about the family in the middle of private property? Because private property creates the space for families to live out their freedom and the responsibility. Now, Christopher Dawson, who you should also read, Christopher Dawson says cultus, that is religion, is the driving force of culture. Now, I'm about to talk about socialists here in a second. Okay, where does cultus get passed down? In the homily? In the family. Cultus gets passed down in the family. So where does human flourishing, what is the most essential thing in nature for human flourishing? For living out according to their maximizing the potential according to human nature, which we'll call human flourishing. What's in nature? What's the most essential thing for human flourishing? The family. The family. Right? That's why it's called the domestic church. This is where you learn to live. I always tell my children, it's easy to get along with your friends. Can you get along with your brothers and sisters? It's easy to be nice to your friends. Oh, so nice to see you. Oh, yeah. You're like, don't touch me ever again. Stop it. All right. Some of them are back there like, we don't do that, Dad. Okay. Their father's not perfect either, for the record. Okay, as they can tell you. All right, they're sweet. All right, so it's in the family that you flourish. Okay, and then you need to flourish. You need private property also. There's certain economic things. Why do you need economic liberty? Why do you need free exchange or free association, right? Because it gives you the ability to provide for your family so that you can grow and then build cultus. So Joseph Pieper talks about leisure as the basis of culture, right? And so you need a certain more than subsistence to be able to develop schola, leisure, where culture develops. And then you need all these other things. Then you need the church. You need religious liberty in the church that enables you to be able to go and worship in community. And there's other elements. So politics, the purpose of politics is justice and peace. But politics and society are not the same thing, right? There's a whole host of other layers. The family, the church, civil associations, schools, voluntary associations, Authenticum, the Knights of Columbus, et cetera, businesses, hospitals, all these things help enable human flourishing, right? And the purpose of politics is justice and peace so that families and schools and churches can be able to live out their freedoms and responsibilities and pursue human flourishing. And so it's important that we don't reduce society to politics. And that's why Cardinal Ratzinger Benedict XVI talks about the purpose of politics is justice and peace, following Augustine and others, and not saying that the purpose of politics is human flourishing. Okay? Think that's done? Thank you for your time.